Okay. Video seems good. Audio, I have no idea. So someone tell me if audio is not good. I guess you wouldn't be able to hear me if the audio was not good. Let's see, where did I leave off here? Identifiers, client API, right. Okay, cool. Thanks for joining. There's people talking in chat that don't show up in the viewer list. That's interesting. Computers! They never work. But that's what Rust is here for, to fix. Let's make them start working. Alright, well it's 3:30, so I will get started. Yeah, no, I can see that you said audio is fine. I see people talking, but when I look at the list of people who are in the channel, the people who are talking are not shown in the list of people. It's kind of odd. Oh, there we go. I think it's just on a delay. Cool. All right, so there's a little bit of a delay, so I will, if you ask questions, which you please should. Uh, yeah, I should. I need to get a second display or use my phone or something. This is very ad hoc. I'm not like a professional streamer or anything, but I'm going to try and improve the quality if I keep doing this. So yeah, for the meantime, please ask me questions in the chat about anything I'm doing or anything about Ruma or Matrix or Rust, and I will do my best to answer your questions. So if there's anyone tuned in that is not familiar with anything that I'm doing, what I'm working on is Ruma, which is a Matrix home server that's written in Rust. Matrix is an online protocol for communication. In very, very simple terms, you can kind of think of it as like a next generation XMPP. So it's a protocol for chatting online, sending messages, group chat, one-to-one chats. Basically, you can kind of think of it as being everything that Slack and HipChat are able to do, except it's built on an open protocol, so it's not owned by a company. Anyone can build a client or a server for it, and it's federated, so all of the servers interoperate with each other, and you're essentially joined to one global network that can all communicate, similar to the way you can use an email address and that has a different domain than someone else, but you can still talk via email. Same idea, but for chat. Rust is a new programming language that's been 1.0 for about a year, and you can kind of think of Rust as essentially maybe like a modern C++ that tries to do a lot of fancy stuff to make programs faster and more reliable and safer. And then so Ruma is a Matrix home server, which is the server that you run in order to host your own data when chatting in the Matrix network, and it's written in Rust. So this is the website, Ruma.io. Go ahead and check it out. We've got a Twitter account, GitHub account. And so what I'm doing, so Ruma's in very early development, and right here what I'm looking at is our status document, which shows which of the Matrix APIs are currently supported by Ruma out of all of the ones that are in the specification. So you can see there's a lot of red here. There's a lot to do. For the first release, which is planned for hopefully by the end of the year, possibly a little sooner, I'll actually go to the issues and look at the first milestone. For the first release milestone, we're not targeting federation, so essentially it's just an experimental version that you can use only on your own, like within your own home server. You can't communicate with other home servers, so it's really just for sort of testing purposes. But this should be all of the APIs that are necessary to create an account, create some chat rooms, invite another user on your home server to the chat room, talk with each other, send messages, receive messages, and just sort of the very basic chat functionality. Today I might actually not work on the server component very much. And so I will also mention that Ruma in general is also a bunch of other components. So all of these other components that are part of Ruma, the thing that's just called Ruma is the home server, but I'm also working on a client API and Rust libraries for sort of components of the matrix specification that are useful independent of the home server. So so far that has been Ruma events. So an event is essentially like the basic unit of data in the matrix system. Events are what the servers send back and forth. So an event could be a message or an invitation to join a room or an invitation to start a VoIP call, something like that. Maybe an image being sent to a chat room. So just anything that happens in matrix is represented as an event. And so this crate is a package in Rust. Or a library, I guess. So Ruma events is it's essentially Rust types for all of the events in the system that can be shared by the client and the server. Ruma identifiers are types for the values that represent entities in the system. And by entity, I mean like a user or a room or an event, like essentially like just the ID value has a specific format, and this is a way to make sure that the formats are correct. So that can also be shared across. So the thing that I recently started, there's a few more packages down here, not that important. The thing that I'm working on that I started last night is to break out the API types from Ruma. And what I mean by API types is, so for each API endpoint in the client server specification, there's obviously a request and a response. The request expects certain data to be in there, and the response will have certain data according to the spec. But since both the client and the server need to know about what the data is for these two types, I'm breaking out essentially the request and the response types into a separate crate, which is called a ruma-client-api. So you have the types for the request and the response defined here, and then in the home server is essentially the server-side implementation of that request-response transformation. And then there's going to be this other crate called ruma-client, which is going to be the client-side implementation of making the request and expecting the response. So ruma-client-api is the shared component between those two. So similar to how events is broken out from the home server, the actual request and response types are broken out. I may not do a lot of this on stream because I have a feeling it might be a little tedious because it's just a lot of busy work about filling in these request and response types. But I'll do at least a few just so you can get an idea of sort of what I'm doing here and how it's going to proceed. So let's see. Let's go to the ruma-client-api. And actually I'll go to let me make sure that my font is a big enough size for people to read. I'm going to have to reopen this. Let me know if that font is okay, if people can read that, or whether you'd like me to make the size bigger. That's much bigger than I would normally do, but it's hard to see how that's going to come out on other people's screens. So hopefully that's sufficient. Let me see where I left off, because I actually can't remember. Maybe what I'll do is, we don't need the Ruma status chart for now. Yes, so here's the client API. I had ruma-identifiers open. Okay, so if we look, actually we probably do want the status document, because that's also a good way of showing which APIs we have. So let's do it like this. Okay, so all of the APIs in the client server specification except for one are namespaced under this R0. If you can see here. So they all start with _matrix/client/R0/ blah, blah, blah. The R0 is essentially like the version, so it's sort of like V1, V2, and they're going to revise the namespacing of the APIs as breaking changes are made, which hopefully will be very few and far between. So all of the APIs are prefixed with R0 except for this one, which is called versions. And this is essentially a meta API that tells it, that allows a client to ask the server which versions of the spec it supports. And so hopefully this won't change, or that would be a big problem because there's no way to version it. I guess they'd have to just change the name of the versions endpoint for a new one. So that's what it looks like for now. So everything except that is under R0. So you can see at the root of this crate, we have two modules, version and R0. So version is this top level one that's not namespaced. And you can see under the documentation for this, essentially what we're expecting this to look like. Now, so for the versions endpoint, there's actually no request value. So there's no input. There is a response type, and all that is essentially this is a struct that represents sort of like a JSON object. And there's one field called versions, which is a list of strings, which you can see in the example here. So it just gives you an object with a key versions, a list of strings. And so that's all it is. It's just that. And important, it actually doesn't even show here, but I will show you in the code. Source version. That the response type derives for trait implementations. Debug, which every object or every type should implement just for easier debugging. Clone means you can easily make a copy of it in memory by calling the clone method. Is useful for when you want to extract a value into another object without moving the entire response. And then deserialize and serialize come from the serde crate, and this is what's used to transform this struct back and forth in between JSON. You'll notice also two constants that are at the top level. One is the HTTP method, which is like get, post, put, that kind of thing. And here I'm representing it just as a string, even though generally you want to represent things as more specific types. The reason it's just a string is because I want this part to be agnostic to the type of client that you use. So we could use something like hypers, like in Hyper, the HTTP client. There's like an actual like type for HTTP GET. I think it's an HTTP method enum or something like that. I don't remember offhand. But I don't want to necessarily bind this crate to Hyper. So I'm just going to leave it as a string that's consistent about the way it's formatted, so that a client could choose to use some other HTTP implementation and not need to rely on Hyper. And then path, of course, is the complete path from the path component of the URL. So I'm imagining that basically every one of these API endpoints is going to have a request and response type as applicable, and then this method and path constant, so that everything you need to make a request to this endpoint is in this module. This is a kind of a funny thing, this little // here. This is actually a bug in the latest version of Rust Nightly. They just recently introduced a new system called macros 1.1 for this deserialize and serialize stuff. This derive directive, traditionally you've only been able to automatically derive certain specific traits that are part of the standard library or the core system. And for a long time, a few crates, namely serde, which is the serialization library, has used these custom derive attributes to automatically generate implementations for serializing and deserializing types. This has not been a stable API, so the way this actually worked was by essentially making a copy of some of the compiler internals into an external crate that's hosted on crates.io, and making you essentially run a script through Nightly, or either running a build script on stable to sort of convert this manually, or using this sort of Nightly compiler fork to enable this private API. And the downside of that was because it's compiler internals, the compiler internals would change every few weeks or so, which would break the API, and everyone would have to update to a new version of Serde that fixes the changes because it would break like every few weeks. And it's extremely painful for Rust development using serialization. The good news is that there's this new thing called macros 1.1, which is an effort to stabilize sort of a very small subset of that sort of transformation API, not for all macros in general, but just to support this case of custom types being passed to the derive directive. Oops, what did I just do? I have no idea. Okay, so the reason, anyway, long story short, the reason that this / appears here, this is actually just this doc comment right here, but there's a bug in the custom deserialize, or the custom derive implementation in Rust Nightly currently that doesn't correctly strip that out when making the doc comment. So that will probably be fixed in a upcoming Nightly. So basically just imagine that that isn't there. That's just a bug. All right, long story short. Okay, so we saw the versions endpoint. Let's see, let me go back to, right. So then in R0, you can see all of these different categories for endpoints. And this was a list that I came up with last night to essentially categorize all the different APIs in as succinct a naming scheme as I could come up with. You notice in the status document, these are also grouped into sections, and the sections have kind of like long descriptive titles in some cases. These come from the specification itself, which describes these in this way. So you can see like account registration and management, adding account administrative contact information. I wanted to use shorter names for the modules. There's also this client server APIs, which is, I think, not actually sure. This is generated from Swagger data that's in the official Matrix documentation repo. And this has yet again different names and categorization for the different APIs. You can see I can expand one of these, and there's actually a bunch of APIs under this. So I kind of went back and forth between the categories here and the categories here to try and figure out like what is the best grouping for them. In the end, I decided to go with the spec, since I think this is not canonical. This is just kind of like how they chose to group it for the like event schema or the API schema in their Swagger data. And so this is specific to a client implemented directly from the Swagger data. And I think I would rather be truer to the spec in terms of grouping. I feel like this is more logical for the most part. Like when I'm looking at this one and I'm trying to figure out where a particular API is, it's sometimes not obvious because some of these groups are very specific and use a slightly different name than what the APIs actually are. And some of them group in a very large amount of operations. So like room participation is a huge, actually it's not as big as I remembered, but essentially there's a lot of different type of stuff in here. It also uses very confusing terminology for directory versus discovery. It's funny, what we would think of as a directory would be like, essentially listing rooms that you can publicly join. So I would think of discovery as directory. What directory means in the API is making human readable aliases for rooms, where a room normally has this completely opaque ID that doesn't mean anything to a person. So they call that directory. So I think I use different terms here. I use the term directory to mean what people would normally think directory means, like a listing of rooms, and then alias for dealing directly with room aliases. I think this terminology is especially confused because in Riot, the web client, it actually uses the term directory for this. So it uses it the way I'm using it, and it's really just the specification and the path of the URL that seems a little misleading. Anyway, so here's the types. Before I go further, I'm going to check the chat to see if there's anyone asking questions. What bitrate am I streaming at? I think it's does it say? It's like 600, 800. It's pretty low. I don't have a great connection. But I'm moving in a few months, and I will probably have a more high-powered connection. So if you're seeing any lag or anything, that will probably hopefully improve. HTTP2 with Matrix. Yes, I don't think matrix itself cares at all about the HTTP mechanisms. Essentially, that exists at a lower level than the matrix protocol. So if the server that you're using or the client that you're using supports HTTP2, then there's no reason that matrix won't accept it. That will be fine. So let me show you just what I did here, and maybe I'll do a few of these. So if we look at R0, I think I started account. Yes. So let's go to the account. So here's endpoints for account registration and management. And you can see I'm using actually the names for the modules are essentially names that I came up with that describe what the API does. So you're changing your password, you're deactivating your account, you're registering your account. And then the description has the actual HTTP method and path. And let's take a look at the register type, because I think that's the only one I've done. And then so all of these modules are going to follow the same format, where there's a request, a response, HTTP method, which is post in this case, the path, which is the full path that the client would need to know in order to make a request to a given home server. And then the request and response types, which for some reason are not, let's see, did I not fill in the request yet? I did. Maybe I didn't regenerate. Oh, let me switch this over. Maybe I didn't regenerate the docs since then. Let's see. So cargo, doc, no deps. I only care about mine. Oh, there we go. I just didn't regenerate the docs since I made those changes. So here's the request types for... Oh, actually, we need to go back here. So this one actually has an additional type called a registration kind. Registrations can be either for a real user or for a guest user, meaning one that's not going to be kept around necessarily, or the user is not going to re-log into the same account. Doesn't need to provide any information. They can just get chatting right away. So you can see in the request, the kind can be optionally specified, and if it's not, then it assumes it's a user. Notably, Ruma, the home server, does not actually support guest registrations yet, and probably will in a future version. I mean, it definitely will in a future version, but it's not targeted for the first release. So you can see this is really cool. Rather than having a simple JSON structure, and this is especially what I like about Rust, is being able to use an option type in something like this. This is something where seeing the schema of an event or of a structure like this is very confusing and potentially misleading in JSON, because very often people who are documenting this kind of thing forget to mention which of the fields are optional and how they're represented if they're optional. Does it need to be present and a null value, or can the field be left out entirely? I found a lot of APIs that don't make that clear. So what I really like about representing even what's effectively JSON as Rust types or a Rust structure is that you know exactly the answer to that question. And whether or not the field can be omitted entirely is based on the implementation of the serialization. I think SERDI by default allows a field that's optional to be completely left out in the case where there's no value, and it'll just default it to none, which is the variation of option where there isn't a value. But this is great because it tells me exactly which things are optional and exactly which things always need to be specified. So I'll go through documenting that stuff later. The response object is just a bunch of strings. Now this is interesting. This is kind of where I left off last night, that when we think about using this crate for the client types talking directly to the server, we can actually be smarter about what some of these types are, because, for example, in the request, let's say the server received this request, it can't, even though, let's say, a username has a specific format, we know that, or we don't necessarily know that the data that we got treated it as a special format. So what I mean by that is, like, this is essentially, it's not just a string, but it's a username local part, which could be represented as a Rust type to get some extra validation and correctness. And when we're talking about using this on the client side from Rust, we could also use the same type, and that would mean that it would be impossible to construct an invalid request, because you get the type system to validate that this value is correct at compile time. Now, the problem with that, with sharing them and using smarter types, is that on the server side, the server can't actually assume that the client request is being made from the Rust client. It could come from anywhere, including the browser, curl, some other client implementation, the web, and it could come from anywhere. So it can't assume anything about the input. It can assume basic JSON data types, but it can't assume special custom knowledge of a matrix type. And by the way, the only reason it's able to know about this is because this registration kind type has a direct mapping between a string and this Rust type that it knows how to convert between. However, something with more complicated validation, like a user local part where it like needs to know about the types of data and stuff, that makes it more complicated. So I'm trying to think about how I want to solve that, if at all. If I just want to stick to generic types like string as input, because essentially the server is the lowest common denominator when it comes to request and response types. The other thing I was thinking is that I could use a custom type here and just have deserialization logic that essentially fails deserialization if it can't, like similar to the way this does it. So even though it's more complicated, that could work. The problem is that will result in possibly worse error messages for the user in the case where they submit something that's invalid. So right now, where we're essentially capturing it as a string and then converting it into a username to do validation, and then if that fails, essentially returning a response that says, username contained invalid characters or something like that. If this validation was happening at the deserialization layer, I'm not totally sure offhand if there's an easy way to return an error like that, or whether the user would end up with some sort of like 500 request or 400 request, I guess, because of essentially like bad deserialization. So anyway, I think what I'm going to do for now is just leave it with the kind of simple string type and continue thinking about that and thinking about whether it's worth it or not to do that kind of validation, because I really would like to have the extra type level validation on the client side. Anyway, so that's that problem. If anyone has any ideas on that, if anyone has any extra ideas on that, I'd be all ears. So that's kind of where I'm going with that. So yeah, let's go take a look at, as I was putting this in. So what I was looking at is I have a few of these API types already in Ruma. So now we're looking at the actual Ruma home server code, and you can see these registration request and registration response and registration kind are just copied directly from this project. I started with the ones that I've already done, and I'm converting it into this new ruma-client-api format. I think this is pretty much done. I guess the difference now is that I'll also need to document the fields here. I'm not going to do that on the stream because that's going to be pretty boring. And in general, I think filling in all of these is going to be pretty boring because it's basically going to consist of either copying stuff from Ruma into this new crate, or for the API endpoints that Ruma doesn't implement yet, looking at the spec and essentially translating what is written in the spec into a Rust type, which will not be particularly interesting to watch. So maybe I'll just do one of these, so you can kind of see what the process looks like. Let's take a look at, let's take a look at what's in this directory. So I guess account is the other one we want to deal with for account information. So in this, in this module, which is for account data, we have deactivate, change password, and requesting validation tokens by email. So these two APIs, the request register token and request password change token, that's a way of essentially sending, doing this like standard email validation system where it emails you and you have to click a link in the email to verify that you actually received it and that you own the email address. So there's one each of those. One of them is for triggering a request token email during the registration process, and the other one is for changing your password. So I imagine that they're going to be nearly identical types as far as request and response. Change password and deactivate are also both implemented. The request token APIs are not implemented in Ruma yet because they're new. Actually, they were added since I was working on account-related stuff. Deactivate actually just got implemented in the last day by a contributor, so thank you very much. I'm really pleased to see that there's people contributing to this project already, including filling in entire APIs that I haven't worked on. So that's really great. That's going to really accelerate the development and get everyone to a release of Ruma before I would have been able to do it by myself. So let's take a look at, I guess, the account. Oops, them. Okay, so account password request. The only thing that there is for the request is a string with the new password. That's pretty easy. So for change password, we've got this clone debug. I also need to do serialize, since this actually will work on both ends of the request. And since they're namespaced into the module, I can get rid of the prefix on the name and just call it request. The request type, I'm not sure how useful a doc string that is, but I don't like to leave things undocumented even if it's pretty obvious. And then there's no response type for this, so let me see, what is the response type here? So there is no response type, you're just expecting a 200 OK status. That's interesting. So the other thing we need is the HTTP method and the path. We'll put those up here. And that's post, and it's matrix client R0 account password. Boom, that's it. Let's take a look at the docs to make sure it all looks nice. So that was change password. Oh, request didn't show up. Why is that? Because I didn't make it public, because it didn't need to be public in Ruma. And that's why I like to check the docs. Make sure that I can find like this is a much nicer way of kind of getting a visual on the API of a module rather than looking at the code. Like I don't think I would have noticed that pub was missing if I hadn't looked at the docs. So that's pretty useful. All right, cool, easy enough. So we've now moved 2 of these over. That was pretty fast. Let me do one more. Let's see if there's one that has maybe a request and a response type. Deactivate account. This actually, does it have, so it has an access token, but it doesn't have a request or a response type. Interesting. Account data has, that's interesting. This doesn't have a request either. Or maybe it's defined below. I guess that one doesn't, or we'll have to look at it later. Maybe we'll do the session management one, because I think those have session. Why is versions in here? Oh, I just pasted that, then that wasn't actually right. So this would be under login. So login response. We have a login response, but not a login request. Interesting. Oh, I guess because the login request, let's do clone debug. The login request is handled through the user interactive authentication, which happens in a middleware layer. So that's not actually part of the it's not part of the body of the request that's specific to this API. Okay, so let's copy over this guy. This is also a post, and this is R0 login. And then I think we have a log out here too. Where's log out? I thought there was a log out. Maybe it's in a different module. Yes, there is a log out. It's funny that that's not in the same place. And this has, again, no request and response type. So I'm picking really uninteresting ones to do, but I guess that's okay. None of these require any extra information. I guess the registration one was the most interesting. Or actually, the create room one will be interesting, but I think that one is not done that one's not done on the. Actually, I guess we could do that one. let's see, so that would be room creation. Ah, yeah, there we go. Here's a more interesting one. So we're done there. Oh, I guess I need to add log out, even though there isn't anything else here. There isn't a type here, but it still needs the URL and everything. So log out, I believe, is, let's go back to log out. So it's just log out, same as this, but log out. And it doesn't say what type of method it is. I think we can go to server to see. Logout is a post. And the path is logout. Okay. Easy. Boring. But so that was under session. So there's our login and logout. Both of them only just have the address of the endpoint. There's no request and response type. So let's see, room. This is the one that's going to have the room creation. So I guess we're going to want to call this. Let's see. So it's called room. This is going to be called pubmod create room. And this is, let me copy this guy, r0/create room. I think camel case like that. Yep. Kind of annoying that they use camel case, but whatever. That's just really just a preference. Okay, and then we're going to need these guys. Oops. And this is going to be a post to create room, and then we're going to need these request and response types from, where did this go? Create room creation. So we're going to steal these from Ruma. Creation content, create room response. So these are the three. Okay, these all need to be public because they're now part of the API. We can get rid of create room as part of the name. So this is the request type. This is the response type. Creation content. Let's see, how do they define what creation content is in the spec? I don't remember offhand. Essentially, it's extra keys that get added to the new event. Where's creation content? Extra keys to be added to the content of the m.room.create. The server will clobber the following keys. Creator. Future versions of the specification may allow the server to clobber other keys. So I think the only thing that this is used for is, this m.federate option, which allows you to specify at room creation time whether you want this room to participate in federation with other home servers. You can actually disable that if you want it to be a server that's scoped, or a chat room that's scoped only to your home server. So I guess I would describe this as extra options be added to the m.room.create event. Okay. Here's another case where I'd really like to use a smarter type. And actually I can in response types, because they're typed in both cases from Rust. Interesting. So it's really, the request is the only one where I have to worry about using more common types for deserialization. Anyway, I don't actually have a type ready to use for this yet. Even though it's a room ID, I believe it actually only shows the local part of the room ID. Oh no, it shows the full room ID. Interesting. So let's actually make that a room ID then. So this will be room ID, and that means that we're going to have to do use ruma-identifiers room ID. Remember, ruma-identifiers is this other external crate that's part of the Ruma project, and that has the types just for these identifiers. And I don't think I've used that in here yet, so if I try to document this, I'm going to get a compiler error because room preset, what is it complaining about here? Yeah, so I'm missing an external crate. So what I need to do is cargo add ruma-identifiers, and then let's go to our lib file, and we need to extern crate ruma-identifiers, and then that should work. I think there might have been some other error there. I have to see what that was. So, what? No matching package named ruma-identifiers. Oh, it's because it has a dash in the name, not an underscore. Let's try that again. Okay, there we go. I thought I saw some other error. Was there another? Oh, room preset. Where does room preset come from? Interesting, that comes from room. Let's look at the room preset. Oh, interesting. Convenience parameter for setting new default state events. So we need to actually move this into ruma-client-api also because it's a dependency of the request object. So it doesn't know about room preset. It doesn't know about room ID? I thought I imported that. That's where, oh, maybe I didn't save the file. So let's stick room preset. Let's stick that in here. And these ones actually need to be renamed. And so we need to do, because if I don't change anything, it's going to, when this is serialized to JSON, it'll be a string with exactly this capitalization. But in the spec, it's actually snake cased, I think. So if we look at, yeah, room preset is one of private chat, trusted private chat, or public chat. So this needs to, we need to tell Serde to rename this to private_chat, all lowercase. And then we do the same for these ones. This one is public chat. And this one is trusted private chat. Okay, so that does that for us. Put this up at the top. I like having these in alphabetical order, just because it's easier for me to find stuff when I'm looking through a file. Okay, let's see if that'll compile. What? Room ID is undefined. Oh, it's because it's in a module, so I have to use this inside the module, not at the top scope, because I have an inline module. So that should work. Okay, let's take a look at the docs. Let's see how that came out. Okay, there's our create room module. Excellent. I think that's everything we want. So other than needing to document these fields, which I'll do later because that'll be boring. Cool, looking good. So that was a more interesting one. I think that's all I'm going to do on this client API for now, just because it's going to be kind of a lot of this. I don't think it's, and once you've seen one of them, I don't think it's all that interesting to watch. And there's so, I mean, look how many of these there are. It's going to take forever. It's kind of just busy work. But let's quit this. And have I made a commit on this yet? I guess not. I guess I'll make a commit and send this up because be nice for people to see the source code for what I worked on the screencast. So let's say define module layout and add a few and fill in types for a few APIs. Okay, let's push that baby up. So once I get done with filling all of these out, then I will publish this crate to crates.io, and at which point I will go back into Ruma, the home server, and I will remove all of the types that got moved out into that other crate and depend on that crate and then import them from the crate so that they're actually shared. Okay, ruma-identifiers. Oh, the reason I was looking at this is because when I was thinking about that thing last night about having smarter types in the requests, and I wanted to have a user ID in the request type. You notice in the room creation API, the username. No, not room creation, but account creation. I think it's the register endpoint. The register endpoint allows you to when you specify your username, it's just the local part. And so I don't actually have a type in ruma-identifiers for a user ID local part by itself. The user ID is like the full thing, which is the @ symbol, the local part, a colon, and then the server. So I think I was thinking about splitting that out and having the local part component. You can see it's here. There's a method on this type called local part, which just returns just the username as a string. But I was thinking about making that a type because it actually has validation on it. Like when you create a user ID, it validates that there are only certain characters allowed in the local part. So moving that out into its own type would allow you to use it separately from the entire user ID. And I was looking at this because I thought I'd done that. And I'm seeing here that actually I did 6 weeks ago. I have a branch called user local part. And I'm wondering why I didn't do that on master. Maybe I was just seeing if it was worth it. Let's take a look at what it actually has. So that would be git log-p. What was it called? User local part? Okay. Implement clone for user local part. So I changed this string representation to a user local part type. This looks like pretty full featured. So now I have this user local part which just wraps a string. And when I'm creating the user ID, I create a new user local part and then format it. Okay, this looks right. And that's it. I wonder why I didn't put this on master. Maybe I just thought I think the reason I didn't put this on master is because it's doing it's kind of not super performant. I mean, not that this kind of string manipulation would matter much. I mean, maybe it would, considering you're doing this type of conversion like at least once for every request or for every event that you transfer in the API. But essentially, we're doing a few back and forth conversions between strings and more specific Rust types. And I was trying to, I guess, think of a better way to do that. So this is not really high priority, though, so I think I'm not going to worry about it for now. I'm just going to leave it sit here. I've already pushed it up, so I can think about that later. Before I switch to another topic, let me check the chat. Yeah, just essentially using a new type to give it a name, even if it, in the end, is not anything special. I feel like that's not really different than just having the field have a name. Like, you already know what it's for. What I really want out of the extra type is the extra validation, like the correctness that it would bring. Anyway, that's a minor point. We'll figure it out. So let's get rid of ruma-identifiers for now. Client API we don't need for now. Let's go back to Ruma. Oh, you know what? So maybe what we'll do right now is review the pull request that I recently merged, because there were two. Okay, this one's still going. There are two pull requests that I merged yesterday. Let me look at my log here. So we have the deactivate endpoint now, and the endpoint for account data, and I thought there was another one. Did I not pull the latest commits? Oh, that would be why. Okay. So we've got deactivate is new in the last 24 hours. The room join endpoint is new. And I thought there was another one that was combined into one of these pull requests. Oh, I think account data also. Anyway, there's one thing that's getting a little messy, which is the migrations directory. I've been adding different tables in different migrations, but it occurred to me when, we're used to developing applications this way, when it's like a website that you're going to deploy on your own and your users don't actually run the code. But I realized the only time a migration matters in the context of Ruma is between released versions of it. So we only really need one migration that has everything from the initial version of the server, and the only time you're going to need a migration is when you upgrade to a new version of Ruma that modifies the database in some way. So with that in mind, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do make dir migrations 001 pre-release maybe. So this is also, I haven't documented this anywhere because there hasn't been a release yet, but I'm not planning to support any sort of backwards compatibility between versions of Ruma that are released prior to 1.0, just because I think that's a mistake that a lot of projects make, that they end up with these large user bases using essentially beta software, and then they have to maintain backwards compatibility just because there's people using them, and so they're now locked into essentially like early design decisions that they made that may not have been good. And I'm not willing to do that for Ruma. I want the 1.0 version to be really clean, because if we're talking about software people are going to be using potentially for years, I don't want to have any cruft like already right out of the gate for 1.0. And so I'm going to make it clear that if you're using any sort of pre-release version of Ruma, like before we say, okay, you can now swap out Synapse for Ruma, like there, it's good. Before that point, I really want it to be considered experimental only. So if you're an early adopter, you're someone who is involved in the development, or wants to see how well it works and wants to help us test it, but to actually use this as your primary home server before that point is, and to expect that you can continue using the same release is not a guarantee. Now, that's not to say that there will be breaking changes necessarily in every release, but I'm essentially reserving that right. Anyway, so what I want to do is, I'm not sure if I know Bash well enough to do this, but so in each one of these directories, there is a file called up.sql and down.sql, and I want to just essentially concatenate all of the ups into a new up in the pre-release directory and all of the downs into one down. And I think I might be able to do that with, let's try it. Let's do cat migrations ** up.sql. Did that work? That totally worked. Ha! So ** means, I guess it means all directories. I wonder if that would have worked with **. I don't think it would have. Oh, that did work with **. Okay. Cool. So for every directory, find the file in it called up.sql and concat that. So let's do that and write the output into migrations 001 pre-release up.sql. And then we'll do exactly the same thing for down. Let's see. And that should have, yep. And so now we can git remove migrations.002, 003, 004. This just cleans it up a little bit, so it will also help with conflicts. Like what happened last night as I was merging two pull requests that both added a table, and they both added directories starting with 006, I think. Oh, I guess one of them I had him rebase, so it got changed to 07. But essentially one person had to rename the numbers just because they were working concurrently. So this removes that. We'll just have like a diff in one file, basically. Okay, so let's do migrations 001. And let's sort these. Very nice. I'm liking this so much better. Up.sql. So let's put this in order too. Very exciting to watch on stream. Watch me alphabetize a bunch of SQL create table statements. Sorry about that, but might as well do it while I'm in here. Count data, rooms goes above users. Room aliases, room memberships. Events goes above room aliases. There's got to be a way to move a block of code based on the alphabetical sort of the first line of the block. I bet there's some clever way in Vim to do that, but that's way beyond my Vim capabilities, I'm afraid. Okay, we're all good, and let's run the test suite just to make sure that this all still works. Yeah, let's do the whole test suite. Oh man, you know, this might actually take a few minutes because I realized I accidentally deleted the old... Oh, this is a pain. So I updated the version of nightly Rust that is used by Ruma in development. Because of all the macros or asserty code generation stuff, I wanted to not have to worry about new versions of nightly coming out and it breaking compilation of the plugins. And so I have, in the Docker-based development environment, I have a specific version of the nightly Rust tagged so that it only builds against that version, and then I sort of conservatively update it as I need to and make sure that it still works. And so the other day I wanted to switch over to the new macros 1.1 version of Surdy and get rid of all this nightly nonsense. Not get rid of nightly entirely, but just not have to worry about the dance of lib syntax. But unfortunately, Diesel, which is the other project that I use that uses procedural macros, had at least at this point had not updated yet, and so that failed to compile on the newest nightly. And like an idiot, I deleted the old version of the Docker container from my computer before I actually verified that that Ruma would build against the new one. So I had to revert that, and now I have to re-download this friggin' Docker container. That's the way it goes. So this actually might take a few minutes. This would be a good time for questions if anyone has any questions about Ruma or Matrix or Rust. In the meantime, actually what I want to do is take a look at Diesel. Because today, actually, Sean, who's the author of Diesel, you can see he's already doing it, derive insertable. He's working on a version of Diesel CodeGen that uses derive, this new macros 1.1. It was supposed to come out today. Let's take a look at the Gitter channel, see if he is... Alright, well, it looks like no new news here. Huh, This is cool. You can actually see me talking in the Diesel channel from Matrix. I show up as Matrix bot. That's not great UI, but that's what you get for integrating with a proprietary service that doesn't support the Matrix protocol. Okay, so looks like it's not available yet. Let me check releases just in case I'm missing something. Oops, not contributors, I meant releases. Yeah, so there's going to be a release probably sometime in the next 24 hours that will allow me to upgrade the version of Diesel we're using to macros 1.1, and then I can update to the newest nightly because it'll build on that. Ugh. Finally the end of this long, painful journey through procedural macros. Alright, let's see how we're doing. Oh my god, still downloading. I apologize for this. I should have thought of this and done it beforehand. Let me check for questions. Yeah, I know my internet speed is pretty painful. So my internet provider is a company named Sonic.net, which is sort of a small ISP, and it's actually like DSL speeds. So it can be pretty painful when I have to download a big file like this. But because most of what I do is just browsing the web, chatting, and programming in a text editor, I actually don't need very high internet speed for most of what I do. And I wanted to avoid all of the big, cable companies that everyone hates, like Comcast or whatever the hell the one in San Francisco is. I think I probably I won't necessarily be able to avoid that when I move in a few months. And actually, I'm hoping that I get to move into one of the places that has one of the fiber connections. That actually might be a good thing to think about when I'm trying to find a place. Is getting something with a high fast internet connection. If only for making things like this less painful. But yeah, it really doesn't happen too much. I guess I could also explain why I'm bothering to use Docker for this. The reason is because, okay, good, we finished downloading. Now it's just up to the speed of my CPU. The reason I'm using Docker is, first of all, to pin a version of Nightly and make it easy so people just have to do essentially Docker run or Docker pull in order to get a compatible version of Nightly without necessarily having to know the exact date of the Nightly. Also, it's to package other system dependencies along with it. So this is one of the things where I think Docker really shines. It's like when you try to work on a project that's like, okay, install these 16 system dependencies, and 5 of them fail to build, and you have issues all over the bug tracker about people trying to build things on, obscure targets, or just like they made a typo and opened an issue anyway. Like, I just want to remove all of that possible error by packaging up the entire development environment as one thing. So having the system dependencies packaged. The other thing that's really nice about it is being able to use Docker Compose and to have an ephemeral instance of Postgres to use as the test database. So you can see when up here I ran script cargo instead of just cargo, and we can look at the cargo script. Nope, wrong directory. Script cargo. So this is pretty simple. All it does is essentially pipe your cargo subcommand into a version of cargo running inside the image. And you'll notice it's also doing Docker Compose run. And what that means is that it's going to run the dependent service. So I have two services. One that's Rust, which is the one we're using for that one-off, like when you run a cargo command, it's running inside this image, this container. And then there's also Postgres, which binds to the Postgres image, and the Rust image links to the Postgres image. So anytime you run a Rust command, it automatically boots up a temporary Postgres instance, lines up the host names so that the test suite can connect to it with a static address. So that what that allows us to do is in the test suite, we can just hard code the address of the database and of the Postgres instance itself, and we can know that there will always be a Postgres database available at that address when the tests are running, because that's managed by the test infrastructure with Docker. So that's really nice. This is one of the benefits of getting to know Docker really well from my day job, which is working with container stuff. So even though people in the development community may not be as familiar with it as people working in infrastructure, I think it's something that I can do to help introduce it to people working in a different field. Of here's an example of a way that it really simplifies workflow, even though for some people it's a pain. They're like, I just want to install it on my host. I don't want to have Docker just so I can develop Ruma. I understand that, like you just want to work on this Rust program and suddenly this project's telling you, here, install this giant fucking thing that has a bunch of moving parts and a bunch of new stuff to learn. So I think some people who are more inclined to learn that are going to maybe step into the waters and learn it. And otherwise, there should be enough information now in the documentation to, if people really want to, they can reconstruct the development environment on their host. But it's just like, I don't really want to be dealing with support tickets about people trying to figure out like how to install OpenSSL and stuff like that. So I'm like, if you want to do it like the officially supported way, here's essentially like a one button solution. Otherwise, you're going to have to do a little reverse engineering. I think that's a reasonable compromise. Anyway, looks like we're finally getting close to this damn thing compiling, and we're going to get to see the test suite running, which is so fun. Let me see if there's any other quests. Any questions, I mean. A Gitter bridge for Matrix. Yeah, actually, that me talking through the bot that you saw in there, that is the Matrix bridge. I do have a channel in Matrix that's synchronized with Diesel, but that's the way it looks on the Gitter side. So if you go in and look at that chat room on the Matrix side, it does look nice. Like, I see everyone as a normal Matrix user. Some of them have like Gitter in parentheses if their user is on the other side. But the way that's represented in the Gitter chat room on that side is by all of the Matrix people's messages coming through a single bot. I think it works the same way in Slack, although I've actually never looked at the Slack integration because I don't have a use for it. But anything where like it doesn't work that way on IRC because it's cheap and easy to create an IRC user. But when you have these systems where you have to verify your login, like usually either with an email address or in the case of Gitter that you have to log in via a GitHub account, there's no way that they can create one account per Matrix user without having some much more complicated integration that potentially would expose the login credentials to that third-party service to the integration itself. So it's the kind of thing where you might be able to do a better integration if you ran it on your own home server, but you don't want to give your credentials to Riot the company or Vector Creations or whatever they're called. So I think that kind of thing will be a better experience once people are more commonly hosting their own home servers and running their own integrations, which is something that hopefully Ruma will help. It'll be hopefully easier to run a home server. Okay, so we're finally compiling Ruma. That took long enough. Sorry for all the wait. That was not a lot of fun. Messages from my Gitter account. Not sure I'm understanding what you mean then, because I guess I closed the window already. So apparently there's a way for me to link my user to my Gitter user, my Matrix user to my Gitter user. That's interesting. I'll have to look at that. I don't see how they could do that without the Matrix integration having credentials for my user. I mean, I guess OAuth could do that without. Maybe they have an OAuth integration that lets me sign in, but I mean, still, that essentially allows that allows anyone who works at Vector to impersonate me on Gitter, which I don't necessarily want. I mean, I guess that's true for IRC right now too, but for any sort of integration, I'd really prefer to host it on my own, and I think the way it works now is just a stopgap for me. Cool. Yeah, I'll have to take a look at that to see more of the details about how it works. That is interesting. Anyway, it's a little unfortunate that the part of the promise of Matrix is this idea that it can bridge into different existing systems, so you no longer have to like convince people to switch to Matrix with you necessarily, and you don't have to worry about it's yet another chat program I have to install. Well, not really. I mean, it is if you care about this, but for all the people you talk to, the idea is that you don't want to have them do anything in order to talk to them. But for integrations, like, that is a little sketchy. Like, I don't really see how Matrix is going to replace iMessage, for example, because imagine, like, how would you even do an iMessage integration? Like, it's not an open protocol. You can only talk to it through a GUI. Like, there's no API. Maybe it's Apple scriptable, so you'd have to be like running a desktop Mac as integration somewhere. Like, there's no way to do that in a hosted way that's reasonable. So, good. Okay, the whole test suite passed. Everything is looking good. So let's commit these migration changes. Squash migrations into a single one for pre-release. Okay, that makes me feel a lot better, getting rid of all those extra files. That's so much easier. And that also verified that worked, because the migrations run as part of the test suite, so these things wouldn't have passed if that change I just made didn't work. So yes. Is it planned to host all the Ruma docs on the website? Yes. So, well, actually, I'm not sure. So API documentation, like the stuff we were looking at before in like ruma-identifiers, ruma-client-api, then target doc, ruma index. So this kind of documentation I don't think will be hosted on ruma.io. However, it will be linked to from there. And the reason is because there's this really nice website, which you might have seen me using a second ago, for ruma-identifiers. Docs.rs is relatively new, and it's essentially what everyone has been wanting for Rust documentation, that this website automatically builds the Rust doc for everything published to crates.io, and it looks really nice. It has not only the documentation for it as at the API level, it also has the README for the documentation if you click on the crate here, and it has the source code that you can browse through directly from here, and it hosts previous versions of it and everything, so it's really, really nice. And this essentially means that you don't have to do the dance of generating your documentation locally after you make a change to your crate and pushing it to GitHub pages or something, which I think is what some people were doing and trying to automate that through Travis, but it's kind of ugly. It's really nice to have this one central website. There's very similar things for other languages, like people might be familiar with Read the Docs, which is actually a generic documentation host, but for the most part, this is used for Python API documentation. And then for Ruby, there's RubyDoc. Here's another program that I worked on a couple of years ago called Lita, which is a chat bot for Ruby. And this is a very similar website that automatically hosts Ruby API documentation for anything published to Ruby Gems, which is the Ruby equivalent of crates.io. So that's cool. I probably won't document that. The stuff that will be on the documentation on the Ruma.io website, you can actually see some of it's there already. We have a documentation section, and there's going to be two guides. One of them is Introduction to Matrix, which Leah and I wrote, I guess, 2 months ago, maybe 3 months ago. And this is essentially explaining what Matrix is and why you'd care in layman's terms. This is intended for non-technical people, because I find that the Matrix website itself does a really bad job of explaining what Matrix is. Like, if we just take a look at it, I mean, matrix.org. Why is typing so hard? We take a look at the Matrix website, an open standard for decentralized persistent communication. I've already checked out, and I care about what this is. So if look at this. Decentralized group communication, fully distributed persistent chat rooms with no single points of control or failure. Like, all these super technical taglines, like, no one knows what this is. Like, even people who read this on Hacker News, like, they have to look over it a bunch of times, and sometimes they still don't get what it is. So the idea of trying to make bringing this to the common person and saying, I want to be able to chat with my family on Matrix, I want all my friends to be able to use this. Like, this is not good marketing from a user standpoint. So that's sort of what Introduction to Matrix was supposed to be. It's like, let's take someone who doesn't understand anything about computers, barely understands like anything but like going to Google and using email, and explains, how does how does Matrix relate to things that they know? What does it give you that, like, why would you want to use this? Then it has like, bullet list of like the sort of the chat features that you'd care about, and then it has this sort of socio-political sort of analysis of why this matters in the long run, that talks about like what problems is Matrix fixing that you can't, that like what's wrong with just using Facebook chat, or anything else like that. So it tries to explain some of the benefits. So if you haven't read this already, even if you're familiar with Matrix, I'd encourage you to read this, just because it's it's got good information that I think it will be helpful to people that, even if they understand Matrix, you can get some ideas from reading this about how to explain Matrix to people who are not as technical as you are, because it's a really hard thing to do, to explain something well in terms that are simple enough for someone without your context to understand. I mean, that's basically the crux of what teaching is all about. It's a very hard thing to do for anything that's sufficiently complicated. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how to do that for this. I'm pretty pleased with how it came out, and of course feedback is welcome. And so anyway, the other documentation that will be on the site is this using Ruma section, and this is the actual documentation for running the home server. So it's actually going to be pretty simple. It's going to be basically, how do you install it? How do you run it? What are the requirements once it's run? Like, how do you fill out the configuration file? But there's really not much to it, because for the user running the home server, like, they're not concerned with Rust level API documentation or even the Matrix protocol documentation. All they're doing is like setting up a cloud server or a Raspberry Pi in their house or whatever, and downloading this program and running it as a system service. So the documentation on using Ruma will be fairly straightforward, fairly minimal. Okay, so I know I haven't really done much. I haven't actually done anything on Ruma, the home server, today, but I think I'm actually going to stop for the day, because I don't have much time left before I'd have to stop anyway, and this is kind of a good breaking point. So let's see if there's any last minute questions. Looks like not. That's cool. I think I correctly set this up to be recorded this time, so I'll make sure that this gets recorded and saved for anyone who didn't get to watch it. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'm going to try to do a little bit of streaming every Friday, just because I like to be able to sort of share some knowledge, get some people interested in the project. Very happy to answer questions. I mean, the benefit of this is for you, and maybe for me to get some ideas for people about stuff that they see me doing wrong on the cast. So yeah, follow Ruma on, which is ruma.io on Twitter, ruma_io, and follow the Twitter account or the Matrix channel, which is hashtag Ruma at Matrix, or matrix.org. And let's see, yep, hashtag Ruma:/matrix.org is the ID for the Matrix room for discussing Ruma. So I'll announce it in there whenever I'm streaming. And yeah, thanks again for watching.